Hi there. Today we'll be talking about the rise of the modern conservative movement. Thinking about this movement from the 1960s on is a really productive way of trying to get our heads around the last 50 years of American life, and, as we'll see, it forces us into thinking hard about not only the foundations of American society and ideology, but also the whole act of historical interpretation, the project we've been embarked on for the whole semester, and in fact, through the whole span of American history if you've taken it with me. So, not nothing. Although there's a long history of ideas labeled conservative, and it's certainly possible to find a through line connecting some of those ideas to each other, most people agree that the modern conservative movement first developed in the 1930s as a response to the defining moment of modern liberalism, the New Deal. As you can see here, for instance, in this cartoon, which labels Roosevelt's New Deal as full of socialistic experiments. This might have less to do with the beginning of any movement at any particular time, and perhaps more to do with the fact that at least some of the party alignments seem more familiar to us than they did in the 1890s, for instance. Only after the progressive movement flamed out in World War I did American politics start to look a whole lot like they do today, split between Republicans who believed much of the same stuff that Republicans do today, and Democrats who believed much of the same stuff that Democrats do today. Essentially, conservatives during the New Deal rallied around the idea that Americans' problems would be solved better by individuals and businesses than by governments and unions. I'd ask you whether this brand of conservatism, siding with individuals and businesses against government and unions, but now understandably infused with Cold War politics, changed much between the 1930s and the early 1960s, when Barry Goldwater delivered his speech at the Republican National Convention. Was what Goldwater was saying based on the same principles, or was it different? And if it was different, much less the same, why? Regardless, the historiography of the conservative movement really began in the 1960s, that is, while the movement had barely started, and when it wasn't remotely clear what its impact would be. The dominant scholarly voices at this time, the ones assessing Goldwater and others, tended to dismiss the movement as silly or as a fringe group of posers. The scholars who made this argument tended to believe that America after the New Deal and World War II, and in the midst of the Cold War, had settled into a general consensus. New Deal, World War II, and the Cold War were of course moments of national crisis, when people felt that America required unity above all. And in that consensus, these scholars felt, pretty much everyone agreed on the right way to achieve prosperity and defeat communism. This means that in part they heard voices like Goldwater's as being painfully out of step with the times, but it also means that they simply couldn't hear how those voices resonated with a sizable minority of the voting public, much less take seriously what those voices said. So for instance, when it came to Goldwater's campaign, they made fun of his politicking and use of high school girls called Goldwater girls, in ways that frankly now seem pretty sexist. Eventually, though, in the 1970s, scholars started to listen to conservative voices, and in doing so, particularly because of the sources they sought out, they began to establish the big divide in studies of conservatism, between people whose analysis is oriented around politics and those whose analysis is oriented around culture. The first scholars who studied conservatism tended to veer toward studies of the political side of the movement, and paid close attention to the movement's national and ideological leaders, like the intellectual William F. Buckley, seen here with President Ronald Reagan. They found the essence of the movement in a mixture of libertarianism, that is, a desire for extremely limited government, traditionalism, this part could have various meanings, and you might consider what they were, and anti-communism. It should be noted that both Democrats and Republicans were almost entirely anti-communist, but the conservatives may have planted more of a flag there than liberals. Only in the 1980s and 1990s, and especially after the decade-long political dominance of Ronald Reagan, not to mention the election of the fiscally conservative, welfare-reforming, budget-balancing Democrat Bill Clinton, did scholars begin looking at the ways conservatism resonated through the culture. What they found there caused many of them to rethink their top-down notions of how the movement operated. Leaving Goldwater and Buckley out of the story allowed them to examine conservative activists at the grassroots level, and led some scholars to the conclusion that it was these activists, members of conservative evangelical churches, gun-owning groups, anti-abortion activists, and Southern nationalists and racists among them, who dictated the movement's direction, pushing the Republican Party rightward and determining its political course. Scholars are still trying to figure out how exactly the relationship has worked between cultural activists, like we just saw, and political and business leaders. Is the conservative movement characterized by top-down exploitation of the masses, as politicians and business leaders press the buttons of naive activists to swing them into action? Or is it better described as grassroots activists forcing politicians to toe the ideological line or risk losing their office? The issue is complicated by the ways that both sides mix populism, regular Joe populism among the cultural activists, faith in the wisdom of the markets among the business leaders, along with distrust in democracy. Mainline libertarian thinkers like Ayn Rand frequently demean the masses and call for the creation of a super-skilled ruling elite, while religious leaders demand a society ruled by their interpretation of the Bible, not by votes. Either way, the key tension in the movement generated by the constituencies of cultural conservatives and the business and political elite, tension between God and mammon, and between moral policing and libertarian freedom, has given historians an interpretive problem worth dealing with. In your readings, how do you find conservatives and other Americans dealing with and resolving these tensions, particularly between money, power, God, and morality? I'd encourage you especially to consider how these tensions operate not just over the movement's early years, but to see how they recur through the whole of the last 40 or 50 years of American history. As you read, I'd like you to think about what the rise of the conservative movement tells us about America through the past 50 years or so, or perhaps about the post-civil rights movement in America. Does it demonstrate, as this map might suggest, a long-term shift in power away from the industrial Northeast, you can see large parts of that are still colored blue here, and toward the conservative Sun Belt, and the white South in particular? You can see the Sun Belt meaning Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Arizona, not to mention all the states of the former Confederacy. If that's the demographic shift, if it's happening, do we see Americans returning to traditional values, whatever those values may be, or do we see a resurgence of the political power of the racist, or at least race-motivated, whites who dominated politics after Reconstruction in the South and elsewhere, and finally seemed to diminish in power at the time of the New Deal? Or are we reading this wrong? Is the conservative movement actually passing? You can see geographically it seems to be in power, but perhaps its white-leaning demographics will cause it to fade. Obama's coalition, seen here in blue, that won in 2008 and 2012, doesn't look terribly different from the coalition that lost for John Kerry in 2004. But perhaps that's where the strength really is. Regardless of our shaky prediction-making ability, what does the conservative movement reveal about Americans' ideas about themselves, their fellow citizens and their government and their country at the end of the 20th century and the start of the 21st? What caused them to shift their ideas in this direction? I'd also ask you to take an even wider view. As the class winds down, I'd ask you to think about the forces, economic, social, cultural, demographic, and political, that have defined Americans' values and ideas through the centuries. It may be too facile a question to ask, but is conservatism the story of the United States, or is progressivism? Were the Puritans moral crusaders but intellectual freethinkers, conservative or progressive? Was the American Revolution fought against a taxing government but opening up vistas of equality and justifying an activist government if the people consented to it, conservative or progressive? The complexity of these stories and their contests, of course, makes these questions almost laughable, but it's certainly true that people on all sides look to these movements as their forebears. But what if, on the other hand, the story isn't one side's dominance, but the push and pull between the two? What stories get told if everyone is talking?